1% of the people in the general population have the overwhelming amount of money, and 1/10 of that 1% is almost all of that, right? So I think it's like the richest 100 people in the world have as much money as the bottom 2.5 billion. And you think, well, that's a terrible thing, and perhaps it is, but what you have to understand is that law governs the distribution of creative production across all creative domains, right? It's something like a natural law, and we'll talk about that more, but imagine what happens when you play Monopoly. You've all played Monopoly. What happens? When you play Monopoly, one person ends up with all the money, alright. Then you play another game of Monopoly. What happens? One person ends up with all the money. It's actually the inevitable consequence of multiple trades that are conducted randomly. So, if you take 1,000 people and you get them to play a trading game, you each give them $100, say, or $10. And they have to trade with another person by flipping a coin. I win the coin toss, you give me $1, you win, I give you $1. If we all play that long enough, one person will end up with all the money, and everyone else will end up with zero. So it's a deeply built feature of systems of creative production, and no one really knows what to do about it. Because of course the danger is that all the resources get funneled to a tiny minority of people at the top, and a huge section of the population stacks up at zero. But to blame that on the oppressive nature of a given system is to radically underestimate the complexity of the problem. No one actually knows how to effectively shovel resources from the minority that controls almost everything to the majority that is almost nothing in any consistent way. Because as you shovel money down, it tends to move right back up, and it's a big problem. But the thing you want to understand about that 1% issue that you always hear about is that it applies in every single realm where there's difference in creative production. Every realm, doesn't matter, number of records produced, number of records sold, number of compositions written. So here's an example: 5 composers produce the music that occupies 50% of the classical repertoire, right? So that's another example of this Price's law scaling. It applies to all sorts of things, like number of hockey goals scored is also distributed this way. A size of cities follows the same distribution, so people talk about all the time about how unfair it is that 1% of the population has the vast amount of the money, and 1% of the 1% has most of that money, and 1% of the 1% of the 1% has most of that money. But it's an inevitable conclusion of iterated trading games, and we don't know how to fight it. We don't know how to take from the people who have and move it to the bottom, without instantly moving back up to the top. Different people maybe, but still back up to the top, because even the 1% churns a lot. Like, I think you have a 10 chance, if I remember correctly, you have a 10 chance of being in the top 1 for at least 1 year of your life, and a 40 chance of being in the top 10 for at least 1 year in your life. That's in Canada and the US. It's less so in Europe, so there's a fair bit of churning at the top end. It's not the same people all the time who have the money, but it is a tiny fraction of the people all the time who have all the money anyways. The reason I'm telling you about that is because after the peasants were granted their land and started to become farmers, a tiny minority of them became extremely successful, and those people produced almost all of the food for Russia and the Ukraine. If you're accustomed to keeping things in the fog in general, you're going to keep yourself in the fog with regards to your investments. Because in some sense everything you do is an investment. I mean, some of it's quantified in monetary terms, but you're always investing in one man or another. And so I think if your character has been disrupted by your persistent attempts to deceive yourself about the nature of reality, you're going to be a financial train wreck. And I mean, I've certainly seen that in my clinical practice, seeing people burn through amounts of money that you wouldn't think someone could burn through in that short period of time, because of self-deceptive blindness. If you have a high IQ and you're conscientious, which is another trait, then you're more likely to be financially successful, say by the time you're in middle age. And so that looks like 2 temperamental traits whose presence enables you to beat randomness over time. So those traits work very well in this society at this time, but you can also argue that that's also a matter of chance, because there wouldn't be unconscientious people if at some point in the past unconscientiousness hadn't aided their survival. So what constitutes beating a system depends on the parameters that you put around the system. And you can think the same thing about, well, look at how successful he is. Okay. You mean financially? Alright, so then, well, how's his health? How's his marriage? How are his relationships with his children? What price did he pay for his wealth? Like, as you add dimensions of evaluation, whether that particular person won or lost might not be so self-evident. One idea that's very common in our culture is that poverty is caused by lack of money, And that's a really stupid idea, because money is very difficult to handle. I had clients who were addicts and the worst possible thing that could happen to them was that they got some money, they're just done. First of all, they were hanging around with people who were little on the sociopathic side. And so especially if they weren't that bright and couldn't defend themselves very well, as soon as they got money, well, it was off to the bar with all the friends. And one guy I remember in particular, every time he got his disability check, he was gone for 5 days. He usually found him in a ditch, because he'd just go to the bar, spend every cent he had on alcohol, and wake up in a ditch 3/4 dead, eventually completely. And then he was ashamed and horrified and repentant, and he'd straighten himself out again, and then that was all well and good until as long as he was broke, until the next check showed up, and then bang, the same thing. So it's not like money is necessarily a good for everyone. It's hard to manage money, it's really easy for it to disappear. Elderly people have a hell of a time now, because crooks are contacting them on the internet non-stop, and so just giving people money, it's like pouring water in their hands. It's not that helpful, not necessarily that helpful. And then of course contributors to poverty are, well, it's not so good to have a low IQ. People don't like the idea of IQ, because it seems so arbitrary. Have a high IQ, well, it's not like you deserve it. Exactly, you're set up that way pretty much right from the beginning. It's very, 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 very stable. You can make a high IQ person stupider by not educating them up to the level of their possibility, but taking someone who has a low IQ and trying to raise that, it's like, if you can figure out how to do that, well, it's Nobel Prize time for you. Because people have tried that a lot, and our society is increasingly sophisticated. So it's by no means obvious. The liberals think, well, this society is unfair, because there's unemployment, and the conservatives think, well, there's a job for everyone. But none of them think, well, there are massive, massive, massive differences in people's ability, far greater than anyone realizes, and that poses a structural problem. Thanks for watching our video. If you like this video, then please don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel and press the bell icon.